Occupied Germany, late 1944. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses, part of the 384th Bomb Group, held their tight box over Merseburg, their mission to reduce the synthetic fuel plants below to rubble. The aircrews, veterans of dozens of such raids, had grown accustomed to the familiar patterns of German aerial resistance, the stuttering bursts of flak, the agile but ultimately outmatched Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. Their confidence, forged in the crucible of sustained air superiority, led many to dismiss early intelligence reports of a new, faster German aircraft as little more than propaganda or isolated, unrepeatable sightings. This dismissiveness, born of hard-won experience, would soon be violently disproved, shattering the perceived invincibility of the bomber stream and forcing a brutal reevaluation of aerial combat doctrine. Captain Arthur Art Vance, pilot of the B-17G Spirit of St. Francis. Louis, too, observed the usual contrails far below, indicating the presence of piston-engined interceptors climbing to engage. His gunners, already scanning their sectors, reported nothing unusual, just the distant glint of sunlight on aluminum. The typical engagement would involve a head-on pass, followed by a chase, allowing the B-17's formidable defensive armament to create a deadly crossfire. This standard tactical expectation, however, failed to account for the radical departure in propulsion and aerodynamics that was about to manifest. The Messerschmitt Me 262, then in limited operational deployment with Jagdgeschwader 7, represented a fundamental shift in aviation technology. Its twin Junkers Jumo 004 axial flow turbojet engines delivered approximately 1,984 pounds of thrust each, a stark contrast to the 1,200 horsepower radial engines powering the FW-190. This propulsion system allowed the Me 262 to achieve speeds in excess of 540 miles per hour at altitude, a full 100 to 150 miles per hour faster than the fastest Allied fighters, and nearly twice the speed of a fully laden B-17. Such a speed differential rendered traditional interception tactics obsolete, transforming the hunter-prey dynamic into something entirely new and terrifying. The airframes themselves, constructed primarily of duralumin alloys, were optimized for high-speed flight, featuring swept wings and a slender fuselage that minimized drag. The armament, typically four 30mm Mk-108 cannons mounted in the nose, fired high-explosive incendiary rounds at a rate of 650 rounds per minute per gun. A single burst from these weapons could inflict catastrophic damage on a heavy bomber, far exceeding the destructive power of the 20mm cannons found on most German piston fighters. The sheer kinetic energy and explosive force delivered by these cannons meant that even a brief firing pass could tear apart a B-17's wing or fuselage, often igniting fuel tanks or detonating ordnance. Production logs from Messerschmitt facilities, despite Allied bombing campaigns, showed a gradual increase in Me 262 output through late 1944, with over 100 airframes delivered to operational units by October. While this number remains small compared to the thousands of piston-engine fighters still in service, the strategic implication was profound. Even a handful of these jets, if deployed effectively, could inflict disproportionate damage. The Allied intelligence community, while aware of the aircraft's existence, underestimated the psychological impact and tactical disruption it would cause, focusing instead on quantitative superiority. The initial encounters were often fleeting glimpses, too fast for gunners to track effectively, leading to reports of unidentified, fast-moving objects or rocket planes that were often dismissed as battle fatigue or exaggerated claims. The ingrained belief in the B-17's resilience, supported by countless successful missions against conventional threats, created a cognitive barrier to fully grasping the magnitude of this new danger. This confidence, however, was about to be profoundly shaken. The first encounters were often fleeting, almost ghost-like. American bomber crews, accustomed to the piston-engine silhouettes of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, reported strange, fast-moving streaks in the sky, sometimes accompanied by a distinctive, high-pitched whine. These initial observations, logged in mission reports throughout late 1944, frequently lacked sufficient detail for positive identification. Often attributed to optical illusions or exaggerated claims by stressed airmen. Damage assessments from these early engagements rarely indicated hits from conventional cannon fire. Instead, reports occasionally mentioned small, circular perforations in aircraft skin, distinct from the larger caliber damage inflicted by standard German armaments. Analysis of recovered aluminum fragments from damaged B-17s and B-24s later revealed trace elements of different alloys than those typically found in German munitions, pointing to a new type of projectile. Production logs from Messerschmitt factories, later captured, revealed that, by September 1944, over 50 Me-262A1A fighter variants had been delivered to operational units, primarily Airprobungskommando 262 and later Kommando Nowotny. These initial deployments were cautious, focused on pilot training and tactical development rather than widespread interception. The logistical challenges of maintaining early jet engines, particularly their short service life between overhauls, severely constrained their operational readiness. The strategic implications of these early, scattered appearances were largely underestimated by Allied intelligence. The prevailing view, informed by pre-war assessments of jet propulsion, was that the technology was too immature for effective combat deployment. Intelligence summaries from October 1944, based on prisoner interrogations and reconnaissance photography, continued to emphasize the experimental nature of the turbojet aircraft, downplaying its potential as a systemic threat to the bomber offensive. This period of initial contact was marked by a peculiar disconnect: the visceral, albeit fragmented, experiences of the aircrews encountering something entirely new, and the institutional inertia of intelligence agencies struggling to categorize and assess a truly revolutionary weapon. The laughter, when it came, was born of ignorance, a comfort in the known, soon to be shattered. The early intelligence estimates, filtering back through resistance networks and captured airmen, initially painted a picture of an experimental aircraft, a curiosity rather than a credible threat. Allied aircrews, accustomed to the incremental improvements of piston-engine fighters, had little frame of reference for the performance envelope described in these fragmentary reports. The sheer velocity attributed to the Messerschmitt, often expressed in terms of faster than anything we have, was frequently dismissed as exaggeration or the product of wartime propaganda, a psychological weapon rather than a technical one. Yet, as the encounters became less anecdotal and more frequent, a pattern began to emerge in the after-action reports. Pilots described an adversary that simply outran their pursuit, an aircraft that could dictate the terms of engagement with impunity. The P-51 Mustang, the pinnacle of Allied piston-engine fighter design, boasted a maximum speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The Me-262, by contrast, was consistently clocked by its own pilots at speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour at the same altitude, a differential of over 100 miles per hour that translated into a fundamental tactical advantage. This speed disparity was not merely a quantitative difference. It represented a qualitative shift in aerial combat. A Mustang required a sustained dive to reach comparable speeds, sacrificing altitude and maneuverability in the process. The Me-262 achieved its velocity in level flight, retaining energy and positioning. Its twin Junkers Jumo 004 axial flow turbojets, each generating approximately 1,980 pounds of thrust, provided a propulsion system fundamentally different from the supercharged Merlin engines of its Allied counterparts. The implications for interception were profound. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses, cruising at 200 to 220 miles per hour, presented a static target for the jet. Even with escort fighters, the Me-262 could conduct a high-speed pass, unleash its formidable armament of four 30mm Mk-108 cannons, and be out of range before the escort could effectively react. The rate of fire of the Mk-108, approximately 650 rounds per minute per cannon, coupled with its heavy explosive shell, meant that a single burst could cripple or destroy a bomber. Analysis of gun camera footage, when it eventually became available, from downed Me-262s, confirmed the devastating effect of these weapons. The large caliber shells, designed for anti-bomber work, created expansive damage patterns, often tearing apart wing sections or igniting fuel tanks with frightening efficiency. The limited ammunition capacity of 80 rounds per gun for the upper pair and 100 rounds per gun for the lower pair necessitated precise aiming and short bursts, but the destructive power compensated for this constraint. The strategic consequences began to crystallize in the minds of Allied planners. The operational ceiling of the Me-262, reaching up to 37,000 feet, placed it above the effective combat altitude of many Allied fighters and well within the operational envelope of the bomber streams. This ability to operate at altitude, combined with its speed, meant that traditional interception tactics, relying on altitude advantage or sustained pursuit, were rendered largely obsolete. The jet fighter was forcing a reevaluation of air superiority itself. Over the German heartland, March 1945. The B-17 flying fortresses of the 384th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force, pressed eastward, a silver armada against the pale sky, their bomb bays heavy with destruction, destined for the rail yards of Plauen. They flew in the standard combat box formation, designed for interlocking fields of fire, a defensive posture honed through years of brutal aerial attrition. The American crews, hardened veterans for the most part, had grown accustomed to the intermittent, often ineffectual attacks of piston-engined fighters, their confidence bolstered by the sheer weight of their numbers and the formidable firepower of their 10 to 12 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft. Then, a new shape appeared, a sleek, dark silhouette accelerating with unnerving speed from the 12 o'clock high position. It was an Me-262, its twin Jumo 004 axial flow turbojets burning kerosene, a stark contrast to the thrumming radial engines of the B-17s. The jet fighter, piloted by Oberleutnant Franz Schall, commander of Kommando Schall, closed the distance with a velocity that defied the conventional understanding of aerial combat. Its approach was not a gradual convergence, but a sudden, violent intrusion into the bomber stream. The initial pass was a blur. Schall, having positioned himself above and ahead of the leading elements of the 384th, dove through the formation's left flank. His four Mk-108 30mm cannons, firing at a rate of 650 rounds per minute per gun, unleashed a torrent of explosive shells. These shells, designed for maximum destructive effect against large aircraft, detonated with terrifying force upon impact. Damage reports from surviving aircraft later detailed large, jagged holes and severed control cables, indicating the devastating power of the 30mm rounds. In a matter of seconds, the attack was complete. One B-17, Little Patches, flying in the lead element, erupted in a fireball, its wing shearing off under the sustained barrage. Another, Heavenly Body, spun out of control, its fuselage already crippled before plummeting earthward. A third, My Darling, took critical hits to its number 2 and 3 engines, which immediately trailed smoke, forcing it to fall out of formation, a crippled straggler. The entire engagement, from the first sighting to the catastrophic damage inflicted, transpired in under 30 seconds. The surviving crews, momentarily stunned by the sheer speed and lethality of the attack, watched as the Me-262, having expended its initial burst, pulled up sharply, its dark form disappearing into the haze before the B-17 gunners could even properly acquire it. The conventional wisdom of mass defensive fire, so effective against propeller-driven adversaries, proved inadequate against an opponent that could close, strike, and withdraw before a coordinated response could be mounted. The psychological impact was immediate and profound, as detailed in numerous post-mission debriefings, where phrases like "too fast to track" and "came and went like a ghost" became common refrains. The initial encounters, marked by the sheer shock of the Me-262's velocity, quickly gave way to a calculated German response. Luftwaffe pilots, often veterans of years of combat, understood that raw speed alone was not a guarantee of victory against numerically superior Allied formations. They needed to leverage the jet's unique performance envelope, not merely exploit it. This meant a departure from conventional fighter engagement doctrines, which relied heavily on sustained turning fights and energy management within a relatively confined airspace. German tactics evolved rapidly, driven by operational experience and debriefings. The primary engagement strategy became the slash attack. Me-262s would approach Allied bomber streams from above and behind, often from altitudes significantly higher than the bombers, diving to build even greater speed. This allowed them to achieve closure rates that rendered the bomber gunners' reactions and lead calculations almost impossible. The attack was designed to be a single, swift pass through the formation, firing their formidable 30mm cannons, before using their superior speed to disengage and climb away out of range of escort fighters. The 30mm Mk-108 cannon, with its low muzzle velocity but heavy projectile, was ideally suited for these fleeting passes. A single hit from an HEI round could cripple a bomber, and a burst of 3 to 5 rounds was often sufficient to ensure its destruction. The jets would typically target the lead aircraft or those on the flanks, aiming to disrupt the tight defensive box formations that protected the bombers. This approach minimized exposure to defensive fire and maximized the destructive potential of their limited ammunition. Another key tactical development was the roller coaster maneuver. After a high-speed pass, instead of a simple climb, Me-262s would execute a rapid climb followed by an Immelmann turn or a half-loop, repositioning themselves for another attack from a different angle. This kept the initiative with the jets, forcing the escorts to react to their unpredictable movements. The Focke-Wulf 190D9s and Bf 109 G14s, often operating as top cover, would engage the Allied escorts, drawing them away and clearing a path for the Me-262s to conduct their attacks on the bomber formations. The Germans also experimented with formations of their own. A common tactic involved a spearhead of Me-262s attacking the lead bombers, while a second wave would follow, targeting the now disrupted formation. This layered approach aimed to overwhelm the defensive fire and create chaos within the bomber stream. German pilot reports from early 1945 consistently emphasized the importance of surprise and the avoidance of prolonged engagement. Recommendation: maintain high speed, execute swift attack, disengage immediately. The psychological impact of these tactics was considerable. Allied aircrews, accustomed to conventional fighter opposition, found themselves facing an enemy that could appear and disappear with terrifying speed, leaving destruction in its wake. The Me-262s were not designed for dogfighting, a fact well understood by their pilots. Their strength lay in their ability to dictate the terms of engagement, to strike with overwhelming force, and then to vanish before effective retaliation could be mounted. This forced a reevaluation of escort fighter doctrine and bomber defense strategies, but the fundamental speed differential remained an insurmountable challenge. The scatter of wreckage, the grim tally of lost airmen, and the sudden devastating efficiency of the attack forced a brutal reevaluation. For months, intelligence reports on the Me-262 had been filtered through a lens of Allied air superiority, often dismissed as the desperate last gasp of a failing regime, a technological curiosity rather than a credible threat. Now, the tangible evidence of shredded bombers and vanished crews spoke with an undeniable authority that transcended official communiques and optimistic projections. Damage assessments from the surviving B-17s showed a distinct pattern: clean, surgical cuts through wing spars and fuselage sections, consistent with high-velocity cannon fire, rather than the more ragged damage inflicted by conventional machine guns. Interrogation files of captured German ground crew and pilots, once treated with a degree of skepticism, began to yield more coherent narratives of the jet's performance envelope. They detailed speeds approaching 540 miles per hour, a rate of climb exceeding 3,900 feet per minute, and armament typically consisting of four 30mm Mk-108 cannons, each capable of firing 650 rounds per minute. This weapon system, firing explosive shells with a muzzle velocity of approximately 1,700 feet per second, possessed a destructive power far surpassing the 50 caliber machine guns of Allied fighters, which fired solid projectiles at 2,900 feet per second. The sheer kinetic energy and explosive force delivered by even a short burst from an Me-262 could dismember a heavy bomber in a way that hundreds of 50 caliber hits often failed to achieve. Production logs indicated that by late 1944, over 500 Me-262 airframes had been completed, though operational numbers remained significantly lower due to fuel shortages and pilot training deficiencies. The strategic implications were profound. The established doctrine of massed bomber formations, relying on interlocking fields of fire for mutual defense, was predicated on the assumption of conventional piston-engined interceptors. The jet fighter rendered this defense strategy increasingly obsolete, as its speed allowed it to bypass escort fighters and engage bombers with near impunity, often before the escorts could even react. The psychological impact on bomber crews was immediate. The sight of a fleeting, smoke-trailing shape that could appear and vanish in seconds instilled a new, chilling fear. Commanders now faced the grim calculus of attrition. If even a handful of these jets could inflict such damage, a concentrated force, however small, represented an existential threat to the daylight bombing campaign. The comfortable margin of technological superiority, once a bedrock of Allied air strategy, had been abruptly eroded by a single, devastating encounter. The air war had entered a new, more dangerous phase, demanding radical shifts in tactics and aircraft development. Initial encounters, dismissed with a certain bravado, quickly gave way to a stark reassessment. The sheer speed of the Me-262 rendered conventional pursuit tactics obsolete. A P-51 Mustang, with its peak speed of 437 miles per hour, was simply outrun by a jet capable of 540 miles per hour. This velocity differential meant that a head-on pass offered the only fleeting chance of engagement for propeller-driven fighters, a maneuver demanding exceptional pilot skill and precise timing, often yielding inconclusive results. The strategic response began with intelligence gathering. Reconnaissance flights, often at extreme altitudes over suspected German airfields, sought to identify Me-262 bases. Photo interpreters meticulously scrutinized imagery for telltale signs, longer runways, concrete hardstands, and the distinctive swept-wing profiles of the jet aircraft. These efforts identified key operational airfields such as Rhein-Hopsten, Ockmer, and Brandis, establishing critical targets for interdiction. Once identified, these airfields became primary targets for Allied bomber formations, often escorted by large numbers of fighters. The objective was not necessarily to destroy the jets on the ground, which proved difficult given their dispersed parking and hardened shelters, but to crater runways and damage infrastructure, thereby limiting their operational capacity. Damage reports from October 1944 show 12 major jet airfields attacked, with an average of 47 bomb craters per runway. Beyond airfield attacks, a more direct countermeasure emerged: the jet trap. This tactic involved positioning formations of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs in the vicinity of known Me-262 airfields, flying at medium altitudes. The intent was to ambush the jets during their most vulnerable phases, takeoff and landing. During these periods, the Me-262's acceleration was slower, and its maneuverability was constrained by lower airspeeds and landing gear deployment. The implementation of these traps required careful coordination and a degree of patience from the Allied pilots. Fighters would orbit at 15,000 to 20,000 feet, often above a cloud layer, waiting for the telltale contrails or radio chatter indicating jet activity. Once a jet was sighted, the Allied fighters would dive, using their superior dive speed to momentarily close the gap on the accelerating or decelerating Me-262. Specific modifications to existing fighters were considered, but largely deemed impractical given the war's advanced stage. Proposals for rocket-boosted P-51s or P-47s, intended to provide a brief burst of speed to match the jets, never moved beyond limited experimental prototypes. The engineering challenges of integrating reliable, safe rocket propulsion into operational aircraft, coupled with the logistical complexities of fuel and maintenance, proved too great for widespread deployment. Instead, tactical adjustments became paramount. Pilots were briefed to avoid direct tail chases at all costs. The Me-262's speed advantage meant that any attempt to follow it directly would result in the jet simply accelerating away. The emphasis shifted to deflection shots, head-on passes, and exploiting the jet's wider turning radius at high speeds. The instruction from 8th Air Force Command was clear: engage only when opportunity provides decisive advantage. The most effective strategy against the Me-262 ultimately was attrition on the ground. Interrogation files from captured German ground crews consistently highlighted the fragility of the Jumo 004 engines. Their service life was notoriously short, often less than 25 hours, and maintenance was complex and time-consuming. The constant Allied bombing of factories producing engine components and spare parts further exacerbated these issues, grounding more jets than direct aerial combat. The sheer numerical superiority of the Allied air forces also played a decisive role. For every Me-262 that became operational, hundreds of P-51s and P-47s were entering service. This overwhelming advantage meant that even if a jet achieved a momentary tactical success, it was often overwhelmed by sheer numbers, or its airfield was rendered inoperable by subsequent bomber waves. The operational tempo of the Luftwaffe's jet units could not sustain the losses. The inherent advantages of the Me-262, so starkly demonstrated in isolated engagements, could not overcome the systemic collapse of the German war machine. Its production, though innovative, was always constrained by a lack of strategic materials and the relentless Allied bombing campaign. Factories designed for its assembly were frequently targeted, disrupting supply chains and forcing a constant relocation to underground facilities or dispersed workshops. Further complicating coordination and quality control, fuel became an increasingly critical bottleneck. The Jumo 004B engines, while revolutionary, were voracious consumers of J2 fuel, a synthetic blend derived from coal liquefaction. Allied air superiority systematically destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel plants, reducing output to a trickle. By late 1944 and early 1945, operational Me-262 units often received only enough fuel for a single sortie per day, sometimes less. Grounding squadrons for extended periods despite having serviceable aircraft and trained pilots. Pilot training suffered equally. The attrition rate of experienced Luftwaffe pilots, particularly in the fighter arm, was unsustainable. Replacement pilots, often rushed through abbreviated training programs, lacked the nuanced skills required to master the Me-262's demanding flight characteristics, especially its high landing speed and susceptibility to engine flameout. Unit diaries from JG7 record multiple instances of operational losses attributed to pilot error rather than combat. Logistics, already strained by the vast fronts and diminishing infrastructure, proved insurmountable for a high-performance jet. Specialized ground crews were needed for engine maintenance, and spare parts, particularly for the complex turbine components, were scarce. The rapid advance of Allied ground forces further complicated resupply efforts, often leaving Me-262 units stranded with insufficient spares or fuel as airfields were overrun. The strategic deployment of the Me-262 was also hampered by Hitler's insistence on its use as a bomber, the Sturmvogel variant, diverting precious resources and aircraft from its intended